Before we begin tonight's episode, we want to remind listeners that Data and Dissonance is a commentary and discussion program intended for mature audiences, and some of the topics explored may involve government misconduct, intelligence operations, moral injury, and the psychological toll of prolonged conflict and deception. These conversations are not meant to glorify violence or secrecy, but to critically examine the systems that shape our world and the people caught inside them. Listener discretion is advised, especially if discussions of surveillance, corruption, or national security failures are difficult for you. This episode is about asking questions, not handing out easy answers. And as always, we encourage you to think critically, verify information independently, and engage with these ideas responsibly.
It's a new year, and everybody's doing resolutions, vision boards, gym memberships they won't keep, and pretending the world magically reset at midnight. But the truth is, the same systems are still running, the same people are still lying, and the same problems didn't disappear just because the calendar flipped. So instead of guessing what 2026 is going to bring, instead of another panel arguing over headlines and narratives, I figured we'd do something different to kick off the year. Tonight isn't about speculation, it's about perspective, the kind you only get when you've been inside the machine long enough to know where the gears grind, where the grease hides the damage, and where the warning lights were ignored. This is the first Special Guest Friday, and rather than bringing in a pundit or a talking head, I brought in someone who understands systems breaking from the inside out. Someone who doesn't normally do interviews, doesn't chase attention, and definitely doesn't believe the official story is the whole story. Tonight's guest is a man who spent years operating in spaces where clarity is rare, trust is conditional, and the truth usually shows up last, if it shows up at all. He's seen how intelligence is gathered, how narratives are shaped, and how decisions made in quiet rooms ripple outward until they land on the lives of people who never had a say in the process. He's not here to name names, burn sources, or give you a Hollywood version of how things work. He's here because sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't classified information, it's the lies we've all been trained to accept without question. Joining me for our first Special Guest Friday of 2026 is Caleb Rourke. And if you're expecting dramatic entrances or polished sound bites, you're already listening to the wrong show. Caleb, I appreciate you being here, especially knowing you're not exactly a fan of microphones, spotlights, or people asking questions for a living. So let's start simple. When you look at the country right now, the systems, the institutions, the constant noise, what's the first thing that jumps out at you that most people completely miss?
What jumps out isn't the chaos. It's how organized the chaos actually is. People think things are falling apart because nobody's in control anymore. But that's not what's happening. What's happening is that control has become fragmented, outsourced, and sanitized to the point where nobody feels responsible for the outcome. Everyone's just doing their part, following procedure, checking boxes, and passing consequences downstream. That's how you end up with disasters nobody technically caused, and failures nobody is held accountable for, and the public keeps waiting for a villain when the truth is much more boring and much more dangerous than that.
That's a hell of a way to start the year. Basically, congratulations, it's not incompetence, it's process. When did you personally realize that the system wasn't what you were told it was going to be? Was there a moment, or was it more like death by 1,000 briefings?
It's never one moment, because if it were, you could rationalize it away. You tell yourself it was an exception, a bad call, a bad actor. The realization creeps in slowly, usually when you notice that the same mistakes keep happening, the same warnings keep getting ignored, and the same people keep failing upward. You start to see how language gets used to soften reality, collateral, oversight, unintended consequences. And eventually, you understand that those words exist so nobody ever has to say, "We knew better and did it anyway." That's when it gets uncomfortable, because once you see that, you can't unsee it.
Let's lighten it just a notch before everyone drives into a ditch listening to us. People love to imagine intelligence work as slick, hyper-competent, almost superhuman. Be honest, how much of it is brilliance and how much of it is caffeine, duct tape, and hoping nothing explodes before Friday?
If people knew how often major decisions were made by exhausted humans running on bad coffee and outdated information, they'd sleep worse, not better. There's skill, absolutely, but there's also ego, turf wars, and a surprising amount of This is how we've always done it. The myth of omniscience is comforting because it makes people feel protected. The reality is much messier and honestly, sometimes a little ridiculous. The danger isn't that people are evil masterminds. It's that they're human beings pretending the system makes them infallible.
That might be the most reassuring and terrifying thing you could have said at the same time. Let me ask you this, without giving anything away. What's the biggest lie the average American believes about intelligence agencies and national security?
That everything is done for their protection. Protection is part of it, sure, but systems primarily exist to preserve themselves. Once you understand that, a lot of contradictions make sense. Why transparency is selective, why failures get buried, why whistleblowers are treated like threats instead of warnings. It's not a conspiracy in the movie sense, it's institutional survival. The problem is that when survival becomes the priority, truth becomes negotiable.
That line right there, truth becomes negotiable. That's the kind of thing people feel but can't articulate. Do you think we're closer right now to collapse or to total control?
Neither, actually. And that's what worries me. We're closer to normalization. People adapt to dysfunction faster than they realize. And once abnormal becomes routine, it stops triggering alarms. Control doesn't need to be absolute if people regulate themselves, censor themselves, and lower their expectations voluntarily. Collapse doesn't need to be dramatic if it happens quietly, piece by piece, under a mountain of distractions.
All right, before everyone turns this off and moves to the woods, and trust me, I've considered it, I want to pivot just slightly. If someone wants to understand these dynamics, not through headlines or hot takes, but through a grounded, narrative-driven lens, where should they start?
They should start by paying attention to patterns instead of promises. Stories matter because they allow people to explore consequences safely, to ask, what if, without needing clearance or credentials. If someone wants to understand how power bends, how truth gets compromised, and how individuals navigate impossible choices, they should look for work that respects the reader enough not to spoon-feed answers. Understanding doesn't come from certainty, it comes from tension.
I want to dig into something you said earlier about normalization because that word keeps rattling around in my head, and I think people underestimate how dangerous it is. When you say dysfunction becomes routine, I think about how exhausted everyone is, politically, socially, emotionally, and how that exhaustion turns into apathy, not because people don't care, but because caring feels pointless. From where you sit, is that exhaustion accidental, or is it something the system quietly benefits from?
Exhaustion is the most efficient form of control there is, because nobody has to enforce it. When people are tired, overwhelmed, and constantly reacting instead of thinking, they stop asking better questions and start accepting worse answers. It doesn't require coordination or malice. It's a byproduct of complexity layered on top of urgency. Everything becomes a crisis. Everything is framed as immediate. And there's never time to slow down and say, wait, does this actually make sense? Over time, people trade agency for relief, and the system learns it can keep pushing as long as it never gives anyone a clean moment to catch their breath.
That hits close to home because I think a lot of people listening feel that exact thing but don't have the words for it. They just know something feels off. Let me ask you something a little more personal, not operational. When you were still deep in it, still believing in the mission, what did duty mean to you back then? And how has that definition changed now that you've had time and distance to reflect?
Back then, duty meant obedience wrapped in purpose. You believed that sacrifice automatically equaled righteousness, that following orders absolved you of responsibility as long as the mission was framed correctly. Over time, though, that definition starts to crack, especially when you see good people absorb consequences for decisions they didn't make, while the architects of those decisions remain insulated. Now duty looks different to me. It's less about loyalty to institutions and more about loyalty to truth, even when that truth is inconvenient or costly. That shift isn't comfortable, and it's not celebrated, but it's necessary if you want to live with yourself afterward.
I appreciate that honesty because that's the part people rarely hear, the internal reckoning that doesn't fit into sound bites. All right, let's bring it back down to earth for a second, because if we stay this heavy nonstop, people are going to assume we're recording from a bunker somewhere. Day to day, what's something completely mundane that reminds you you're human again? Something that pulls you out of that constant analytical threat assessment mindset.
Honestly, routine. Coffee in the morning, silence before the day starts, doing something physical that doesn't require thinking. Those small, repetitive acts matter more than people realize. When you've spent years anticipating worst-case scenarios, normalcy becomes grounding. It's a reminder that not everything needs to be optimized, secured, or analyzed. Sometimes you just need to exist without a contingency plan.
All right, quick pause before we keep going, because if we're going to talk about systems grinding people down, I should probably remind folks that one of the ways you support this show staying independent is through the Data and Dissonance merch. We've got the coffee blends, light, medium, and dark, all roasted in the US. No corporate nonsense, no fake activist branding, just damn good coffee that fuels long mornings and late nights. Hoodies, hats, mugs, bumper stickers, the whole lineup, and every purchase helps keep this show free from sponsors who'd rather we didn't have conversations like the one we're having right now. Links are in the description. Grab something you'll actually use and let's get back to it. Picking up where we left off, something you said earlier about institutions prioritizing their own survival stuck with me because it reframes so many things people argue about every day. When you look at public trust collapsing across the board, media, government, intelligence, even science, do you think that trust can be rebuilt, or are we heading into an era where skepticism is the default state?
Trust can be rebuilt, but not without consequences, and that's the part institutions resist. You don't restore credibility through messaging campaigns or rebranding. You restore it through accountability, transparency, and a willingness to admit failure without immediately deflecting blame. Skepticism isn't inherently dangerous. Blind faith is. The problem arises when skepticism turns into nihilism, where people assume everything is a lie and nothing matters. The challenge is rebuilding trust without demanding obedience, and that requires humility most systems aren't designed to have.
That's such a clean distinction, a skepticism versus nihilism. And I think a lot of people slide from one into the other without realizing it. Let me ask you something that might sound simple, but really isn't. Do you still believe this country is worth fighting for, knowing what you know now?
Yes, but not in the abstract way people usually mean it. I believe the people are worth fighting for, the principles are worth fighting for, and the idea of accountability is worth fighting for. Blind allegiance to structures just because they exist. No. Patriotism without honesty is just branding. Loving a country means being willing to confront its failures instead of pretending they don't exist.
That answer right there is going to make some people uncomfortable, which tells me it's exactly the right note to hit. If someone feels like they're stuck inside a system that doesn't care about them, professionally, politically, culturally, what's the first step toward reclaiming some sense of agency?
Stop waiting for permission. Most systems rely on people believing they need approval to think independently, to speak carefully but honestly, or to disengage from narratives that don't serve them. Agency doesn't start with grand gestures. It starts with small refusals. Refusing to repeat things you haven't verified. Refusing to surrender your moral compass to convenience. Refusing to accept that power is synonymous with legitimacy. Those choices don't make headlines, but they compound over time.
I want to stay right there for a second because what you just said about refusing narratives hits on something I wrestle with all the time doing this show. People think speaking up is about volume, about yelling louder than the other side. But in reality, it's about clarity, and clarity takes more effort than outrage ever will. From your experience, why do you think so many people cling to narratives they know are shaky, even when something inside them is telling them it doesn't add up?
Because narratives give people identity, and identity feels safer than uncertainty. Admitting a story doesn't hold up means admitting you might have been wrong, misled, or complicit without realizing it. And that's a hard thing for anyone to sit with. Narratives also reduce complexity into teams, heroes, and villains, which saves mental energy. The problem is that reality doesn't care about our comfort, and the longer someone avoids confronting that, the more fragile their worldview becomes. When the cracks finally show, people don't calmly reassess, they double down, because abandoning a narrative feels like losing a piece of themselves.
That explains a lot of comment sections, family holidays, and group texts I've muted permanently. Let me ask you something a little lighter, but still real. When you first stepped away from that world, from constant alerts and threat assessments, did you have any weird habits that stuck around longer than you expected?
Absolutely. Sitting with my back to a wall, scanning exits without thinking about it, waking up convinced I forgot something critical, even when there was nothing on the schedule. It takes time for your nervous system to realize you're no longer operating in a constant state of consequence. What surprises people is that the body remembers before the mind does. You can intellectually know you're safe and still react like you aren't. Undoing that conditioning isn't dramatic. It's repetitive, boring, and humbling.
That's such an important thing to say out loud because a lot of people listening might recognize pieces of themselves in that. Not from intelligence work, but from high-stress jobs, caregiving, financial pressure, or just years of being told the world's about to end every 5 minutes. Do you think modern life is quietly training people to live in a constant low-grade survival mode?
Without a doubt. When urgency becomes the default setting, people lose their ability to differentiate between what's truly dangerous and what's merely loud. Everything feels existential, which means nothing gets proper weight. Over time, that erodes patience, empathy, and long-term thinking. Survival mode is meant to be temporary. When it becomes permanent, it distorts judgment and shortens horizons. That's not an accident of modern life. It's a predictable outcome of how information is delivered now.
All right, I'm going to ask you something that might sound blunt, but I think it's a fair question. Do you think most people actually want the truth, or do they just want reassurance that their side is winning?
Most people want comfort first, truth second, and that's not a moral failure. It's human nature. Truth requires adjustment, and adjustment costs energy. The issue arises when comfort becomes more important than reality, because then people start demanding that reality conform to their expectations instead of the other way around. That's when disagreement turns into hostility, and skepticism turns into denial. Wanting reassurance doesn't make someone weak. Refusing truth once it's clear does.
That's a line people should sit with for a while. Let me pivot slightly. You've talked a lot about systems, institutions, and power structures, but I want to talk about people for a minute. In all your experience, what qualities did you see consistently in the people who kept their integrity, even when the pressure to compromise was intense?
They were usually quieter than the rest, less interested in advancement, and more comfortable being underestimated. They didn't need constant validation, and they weren't in a hurry to be seen. Integrity tends to show up in people who are willing to be lonely for a while, because it often costs you proximity to power. What kept them grounded wasn't ideology. It was a clear internal line they refused to cross, even when crossing it would have made life easier.
That might be one of the most quietly powerful answers of the night. Let me ask one more that feels important, especially heading into a new year. When you look ahead, not in terms of predictions, but patterns, what's something you think people should be paying more attention to that's currently flying under the radar?
Pay attention to how often decisions are being automated or deferred to process instead of judgment. When accountability becomes abstract, harm becomes easier to excuse. Systems that remove human responsibility don't eliminate mistakes. They distribute them until no one feels obligated to fix them. That shift happens slowly, and by the time people notice it, it feels irreversible. Awareness is the first defense against that kind of erosion.
All right, and I ask this knowing it's not something people usually like to hear. If someone listening realizes they've been outsourcing their thinking to media, to politics, to institutions, what's the first uncomfortable step they have to take to reverse that?
Accept that clarity may cost you certainty, and certainty is comforting. The moment you stop outsourcing your thinking, You lose the illusion that someone else has it all figured out. That can feel destabilizing at first, but it's also where real agency begins. Independence isn't loud or dramatic. It's quiet, consistent, and often inconvenient. But it's the only way to remain fully human in systems that prefer predictability over conscience.
I want to zoom out for a second because we've talked a lot about systems, responsibility, and truth, but I think people sometimes forget that underneath all of that are regular human beings just trying to get through the day without losing their minds. When you step back and look at the average person right now, working, raising kids, paying bills, trying to stay sane in a nonstop information storm, what do you think they misunderstand most about their own power?
Most people underestimate how much influence they have simply by refusing to participate in things that feel wrong to them. Power doesn't only live at the top, it lives in compliance at the bottom. When enough people quietly stop playing along, stop repeating things they don't believe, stop rewarding bad behavior with attention, stop confusing popularity with legitimacy, systems start to strain. That doesn't mean everyone needs to become an activist or a crusader. Sometimes the most disruptive act is opting out of nonsense and choosing discernment instead.
That's such a grounding answer because it takes the pressure off people feeling like they need to save the world just to be morally upright. Let me ask you something a little more personal. After everything you've seen, everything you've had to unlearn, what actually gives you hope? And I don't mean slogans or optimism. I mean something real.
Hope comes from watching people rediscover their internal compass. You see it when someone stops parroting talking points and starts asking better questions, or when they admit they don't have all the answers, but still want to understand. It shows up in small conversations, not viral moments. The fact that people are still capable of reflection, still capable of discomfort in the presence of truth, that matters more than any election cycle or headline.
I think that's something people forget. The discomfort isn't a flaw, it's a signal. All right, I want to lighten this just a bit before we land, because if we don't, someone's going to accuse us of trying to start a philosophical support group. Be honest. What's something about the real world that Hollywood or media absolutely gets wrong every single time?
The idea that clarity arrives in dramatic moments. In reality, clarity usually shows up quietly, inconveniently, and without fanfare. There's no soundtrack, no speech, no instant resolution. It's more like a slow realization that something doesn't sit right anymore, and once that feeling settles in, you can't ignore it. Real change doesn't feel heroic. It feels lonely at first.
That might be the least cinematic answer possible, which tells me it's probably the most accurate. Okay, if someone listens to this episode and feels unsettled, not scared, not angry, just unsettled, is that a bad thing?
No, that's often the beginning of growth. Comfort is pleasant, but it rarely leads anywhere new. Being unsettled means you're paying attention. It means something resonated strongly enough to disrupt autopilot, and that's where real thinking begins. The goal isn't to replace one set of beliefs with another. It's to sharpen the tools people use to navigate the world for themselves.
I want to rewind for a minute because we've talked a lot about systems and institutions, but people don't just wake up one day inside those worlds. They come from somewhere. Before any of this, before the operations, before the clearances and the pressure, who was Caleb Rourke? What did your upbringing look like, and what kind of kid were you before the world started asking more of you than most people ever experience?
I grew up in a world that valued responsibility early, whether you were ready for it or not. There wasn't much room for indulgence or excuses. You learned quickly that showing up mattered more than talking about intentions. I wasn't reckless, but I wasn't naive either. I paid attention, asked questions, and learned to read people long before I understood why that skill would matter later. Looking back, it's clear that environment shaped how I saw authority, not as something to rebel against automatically, but not something to trust blindly either.
Was there a moment growing up where you realized you didn't quite fit the standard mold, that you were wired a little differently than the people around you?
Yeah, and it wasn't dramatic. It was the quiet realization that I noticed things other people brushed past. Patterns, inconsistencies, small details that didn't line up. While other kids were focused on being seen or heard, I was more interested in understanding how things worked underneath the surface. That tendency made me good at certain things later in life, but it also made it harder to fully relax. When you're wired to observe, you're rarely fully off duty.
That resonates with a lot of people listening, especially those who felt older than their age early on. What drew you toward service in that world specifically? Was it patriotism, opportunity, obligation, or something harder to name?
It was a mix, but at its core, it was purpose. I believed that competence mattered, that doing difficult things well was a form of service. There was also a sense of wanting to be useful, to contribute in a way that wasn't symbolic. I didn't go in looking to question the system. I went in believing in it. That's an important distinction, because disillusionment hits harder when it comes after genuine belief.
That's something people don't talk about enough, that most people who become critics of systems started out as believers, not cynics. When did that belief start to change for you? Not in theory, but emotionally.
It changed when the distance between decisions and consequences became impossible to ignore. When you see outcomes affect real people while decision makers remain untouched, something shifts. Emotionally, that's when the job stops being just a role and starts becoming a moral weight. You realize you're carrying more than responsibility. You're carrying unresolved questions that don't clock out with you at the end of the day.
How did that impact your personal life, relationships, friendships, the way you interacted with people who weren't living in that world?
It creates separation, even when you don't want it to. You start editing yourself, not because you're hiding secrets, but because the gap in lived experience makes certain conversations feel impossible. You don't want to burden people with things they didn't sign up to understand. Over time, that restraint becomes habit, and habit turns into distance if you're not careful.
That's something a lot of listeners will feel in their bones. Last question in this lane. If you could talk to your younger self, the version of you just starting out, what would you tell him that you didn't know then?
I tell him that integrity isn't something you protect once. It's something you renegotiate every day. I tell him that loyalty is meaningful, but it's not unconditional, and that questioning systems doesn't make you disloyal to the people you serve. Most of all, I'd tell him that clarity often arrives later than you want it to, but it's worth waiting for.
That's where we're going to leave it tonight, because some conversations don't need a neat bow or a tidy conclusion. They need room to breathe and time to sit with you a little longer than what's comfortable. This episode wasn't about predicting the future, assigning villains, or selling fear disguised as certainty. It was about perspective, responsibility, and the quiet, often uncomfortable work of thinking clearly in a world that profits from keeping you reactive. We spend so much of our time being told what to believe, what to fear, and which side we're supposed to be on, that we forget how rare and valuable it is to simply slow down and listen, not for affirmation, but for understanding. And that's what tonight was about, creating space for thought instead of noise, for reflection instead of reflex, for questions that don't come with prepackaged answers. Special Guest Fridays are about stepping off the outrage treadmill for half an hour and reminding ourselves that depth still matters, that nuance isn't weakness, and that not every meaningful conversation needs to end with a viral clip or a talking point. This year, we're going to keep inviting voices into this space that don't need to shout to be heard. Voices shaped by experience rather than performance, by reflection rather than reaction. Some weeks those conversations will be heavy, some weeks they'll be uncomfortable, and some weeks they'll quietly challenge assumptions you didn't even realize you were carrying. And that's exactly the point. Growth doesn't happen in echo chambers, and clarity doesn't come from constant certainty. If tonight made you pause on the drive home, if it made you turn the volume down instead of up, if it made you sit with a thought instead of scrolling past it, then this episode did exactly what it was meant to do. You don't have to agree with everything you heard to take something meaningful away from it. Sometimes the most valuable moments are the ones that make you argue with yourself a little, or rethink a position you've held out of habit rather than conviction. That process isn't comfortable, but it's honest. And honesty is something we're not willing to sacrifice here. We'll be back next Friday with a new guest, a new conversation, and the same commitment to slowing things down and treating our audience like adults who can handle complexity without needing it watered down or weaponized. Until then, take a breath. Stay curious. Question what you're told, including us. And remember to speak truth. Stir thought.
Tonight's episode of Data and Dissonance is brought to you by the Caleb Rourke thriller series, The Covenant Protocol, The Prophet Directive, and Black Echo Rising. These novels explore the tension between truth and power, the cost of silence, and what happens when systems built to protect begin protecting themselves instead. If you're looking for fast-paced, intelligent thrillers that don't insult your intelligence or rely on cheap twists, this series was written for you. All 3 books are available now, with links in the show description. Reading them doesn't give you answers. It gives you better questions.